Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this or confusion that came wrapped in family love, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Your stories matter here too. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who kept secrets from their own mother, especially not big ones. Growing up, it was always just the two of us against the world, or at least that's how it felt to me. My father left when I was 8, not with a dramatic argument or a slammed door, but with a quiet absence that slowly filled every corner of our lives. One day his shoes were by the door, and the next they weren't. My mother never spoke badly about him. She just worked harder, slept less, and learned how to stretch a dollar until it felt like magic. Because of her, I learned early how fragile stability could be and how precious independence was. We lived in rentals most of my childhood, small apartments with thin walls and landlords who fixed things only after you complained 3 times. Every move felt like a reset, like proof that nothing was permanent. My mother used to say, half joking and half serious, that one day she'd own a place where no one could tell her to leave. I carried that sentence with me into adulthood like a quiet mission statement. I studied hard, worked multiple jobs, and learned to save instead of spend. I didn't talk about money much, partly because we never had enough of it growing up, and partly because I didn't want it to define me. After college, I landed a decent job in finance, the kind that sounds impressive at family gatherings, but mostly involves spreadsheets and long hours. I lived modestly, drove an old car, and said no to things other people my age said yes to without thinking. Nights out, vacations, expensive clothes. I told myself it was temporary, that I was building towards something. That something showed up sooner than I expected, wrapped in an opportunity most people would have walked past. A small, aging apartment building on the edge of a neighborhood that was quietly changing. The owner was tired, the units were half empty, and the price was low enough to make my heart race. I ran the numbers again and again, barely sleeping for a week. It wasn't glamorous. The hallways smelled like old paint and dust, and the roof needed work, but it was solid, and more importantly, it was mine, or it could be. When I signed the papers, I didn't tell my mother, not because I didn't trust her, but because I didn't want to explain. I knew she'd worry. She'd tell me it was risky, that I was too young, that debt was dangerous. And maybe she would have been right, but I needed to do this on my own, without her fear shaping my courage. I told myself I'd share the news once everything was stable, once the renovations were done, once it felt real enough not to fall apart under her questions. I moved into one of the units myself, a modest 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor. To everyone else, including my mother, I was just renting an apartment close to work. She helped me move in, commenting on the creaky stairs and the old mailboxes in the lobby. She asked how much the rent was, and I gave her a number that was technically true since I paid rent to the building's account like any other tenant. She nodded, relieved it wasn't higher, and reminded me to always pay on time because landlords could be unforgiving. I smiled and let it go. For a while, everything worked. I fixed leaks, repainted walls, and slowly filled the empty units with tenants who appreciated fair rent and a landlord who answered his phone. I liked the anonymity of it, the quiet satisfaction of building something without applause. When my mother visited, she'd bring groceries or complain about the parking, never suspecting anything more than what she could see. Then, one afternoon, she called me with an excitement in her voice that immediately made my stomach tighten. She told me she'd met a woman at her community center who was looking for a place to rent for her daughter, someone reliable, close to public transit. My mother, always eager to help, had thought of my building right away. She said she remembered a vacant unit on my floor and figured she'd do me a favor by talking to the landlord. I laughed nervously and asked what she meant, but she brushed it off, saying she'd already spoken to him, that he seemed distracted and grateful for the help. I didn't correct her assumption about who the landlord was. Instead, I told her it was fine, that I'd handle it, but she didn't hear me. She was already in motion, already proud of herself. 2 days later, I came home from work to see a neatly printed "For Rent" sign taped to my apartment door. Not the vacant unit down the hall, mine, the one I lived in. My name wasn't on it, but the phone number was unmistakably my mother's. For a long moment, I just stood there, keys in my hand, listening to the hum of the building. I felt a strange mix of disbelief and something that hurt deeper than anger. She hadn't asked me. She hadn't even told me. In her mind, my life was still something she could organize, adjust, improve without permission. And I realized then that my silence had allowed that illusion to survive. I peeled the sign off the door and stepped inside, my heart pounding louder than my footsteps. My phone buzzed with a message from her, cheerful and confident, saying she'd lined up a viewing for the weekend and that I should thank her later. I sat on the edge of my couch and stared at the wall, knowing this wasn't just about an apartment. It was about ownership, trust, and the moment when a child steps fully out of a parent's shadow. I knew the truth would come out soon, and when it did, it would force both of us to see each other differently, whether we were ready or not.
I didn't call her that night. I wanted to, badly, but I knew if I heard her voice while my emotions were still tangled, I'd say something I couldn't take back. Instead, I took the sign, folded it carefully, and slid it into a drawer like evidence I wasn't ready to present yet. I barely slept. My mind kept replaying old scenes from my childhood, moments where she'd stepped in to fix things before I even knew they were broken. Back then, it felt like love. Now, standing in an apartment she thought she could rent out without asking me, it felt like something else. Controlled, maybe, or fear disguised as help. The next morning, she called again, this time more businesslike. She told the woman's daughter was very interested and wanted to see the place Saturday afternoon. I told her calmly that it wasn't a good time, that I wasn't planning on moving. There was a pause on the line, the kind that carried more meaning than words. She asked why I hadn't told her sooner, why I was being difficult when she was only trying to help. I could hear the hurt creeping into her voice, and with it the familiar guilt that always followed me into adulthood. I told her we'd talk about it soon, in person. She agreed, though reluctantly, and reminded me that opportunities didn't wait for people to feel ready. When we hung up, I sat there wondering how she still managed to sound like she was parenting a teenager instead of a grown adult with a mortgage and a life of his own. I also wondered how much longer I could keep the truth from her without causing more damage. Saturday came faster than I expected. She showed up at my door early, dressed neatly, carrying a folder with printed listings and handwritten notes. She looked proud, energized, like someone who believed they were doing the right thing. I invited her in and made coffee, noticing how she glanced around the apartment as if evaluating it through someone else's eyes now. She talked about the woman's daughter, how responsible she seemed, how it would be good for me to move somewhere cheaper and save more money. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. Finally, I asked her why she thought it was okay to list my apartment without asking me first. She looked genuinely surprised by the question. She said she hadn't listed it, just mentioned it, that there was a difference. She said she knew me, knew I wouldn't take the initiative, that I'd thank her once everything worked out. I realized then that in her mind, my independence was still conditional, something she could override when she felt it was necessary. I told her there was something she didn't know. She smiled softly, the way she used to when she thought I was about to confess a small mistake or ask for advice. I took a breath and told her I wasn't renting the apartment from some stranger. I told her I owned it. She laughed at first, a quick, dismissive sound, and said I was joking. When I didn't laugh back, her smile faded. I explained, slowly, carefully, how I'd bought the building a few years ago, how I'd moved in quietly, how I'd managed it myself. I watched her face change as the words sank in. Confusion turned into disbelief, disbelief into something like betrayal. She asked why I hadn't told her, why I'd let her believe I was just getting by like she had all those years. Her voice trembled, and for the first time since this all started, I felt a surge of empathy instead of frustration. I told her the truth, that I was scared she'd worry, scared she'd try to talk me out of it, scared that her fear would become my fear. I told her I needed to prove to myself that I could build something solid, something permanent without leaning on her. She sat down heavily, clutching her folder like a lifeline. She said she'd always sacrificed so I could have opportunities, and that keeping this from her felt like shutting her out of her life. The room filled with a thick, uncomfortable silence. Outside, I could hear footsteps on the stairs, the everyday sounds of tenants living their lives, unaware of the quiet earthquake happening inside my living room. I realized then that my success, which I thought of as private and self-contained, had ripple effects I hadn't fully considered. To her, my secrecy didn't look like independence, it looked like distance. She asked if I was angry with her for putting up the sign. I told her I wasn't angry, just hurt. Hurt that she still saw my space as something she could manage, that she didn't trust me enough to ask. She nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. She said it was hard to stop being a mother even when your child no longer needs you in the same way. She admitted it felt useless lately, watching me build a life she didn't fully understand. We talked for hours that afternoon about money, about fear, about the way our roles had shifted without either of us acknowledging it. I told her she was still important to me, that her sacrifices were the foundation everything else was built on. She told me she was proud of me, though the word came out quietly like she was still testing how it felt. When she left, she took the folder with her, but she left the sign behind, folded neatly on the counter. That night, I walked through the building with a different awareness. Each door represented a boundary I'd learned to respect as a landlord, but not yet as a son. I realized that owning something didn't just give me control, it gave me responsibility, not only to tenants, but to the relationships in my life. I'd wanted independence so badly that I'd forgotten transparency was part of growing up, too. Over the next few weeks, things settled into a new rhythm. My mother stopped trying to manage my living arrangements, but she started asking questions instead, about repairs, about tenants, about how I'd made it all work. I answered honestly, even when it made me uncomfortable. In return, she shared stories about her own fears, about nights she'd stayed awake wondering if she was doing enough or too much. We were learning each other again, not as parent and child, but as two adults with shared history and separate lives. The building remained mine, unchanged in brick and mortar, but something inside me shifted. I understood now that secrecy, even when well-intentioned, could create misunderstandings that hurt more than the truth ever would. And my mother, for all her overstepping, was acting from a place of love shaped by years of uncertainty. The sign incident became a story we could eventually laugh about, only because we'd faced what it represented. Looking back, I don't regret buying the building or keeping it quiet at first, but I do regret not trusting my mother enough to let her see who I was becoming. Independence doesn't mean shutting people out. Sometimes it means inviting them in on your terms and being brave enough to hold your ground when they cross a line. That lesson, like the building itself, was something I'd carry with me for the rest of my life.
In the weeks after that conversation, something subtle but important changed between my mother and me. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden hugs or tearful apologies every time we spoke. It was quieter than that. She started knocking, metaphorically, before entering my life, asking instead of assuming, listening instead of instructing.
And I, in turn, stopped hiding parts of myself that I thought would make her anxious or uncomfortable. It felt like learning a new language together, one where silence wasn't punishment and questions weren't accusations. But peace has a way of testing itself when you least expect it. About a month later, one of my tenants moved out unexpectedly. She'd gotten married and relocated, leaving behind a freshly painted but empty unit on the third floor. Normally, this would have been routine. I'd clean it up, list it properly, screen applicants, and move on. But word travels fast in families, especially when pride starts to replace fear. My mother mentioned, almost casually, that someone from her church was looking for a place. She said it carefully, watching my reaction, as if testing whether this was still a sensitive subject. I told her we could talk about it, that she could pass along the building's official listing once it was ready. She smiled, relieved, and said she'd let them know. It was a small moment, but it felt like progress, boundaries acknowledged, not crossed. Then, a few days later, I ran into a problem I hadn't anticipated. A man knocked on my door one evening, holding a printout with my building's address. He said he'd spoken to my mother, that she told me I was flexible on rent and that I might be willing to make an exception because he was family adjacent. The phrase hit me harder than I expected. I invited him in briefly, clarified the situation, and sent him away politely, but my chest felt tight long after the door closed. I called my mother immediately. This time I didn't wait for my emotions to cool completely. I told her what happened, how it made me feel, how dangerous it was to promise things she didn't control. She apologized right away, genuinely, and said she'd only mentioned it in passing, that she hadn't realized he'd take it as permission. I believed her, but I also realized how easily old habits could resurface, especially when lines weren't reinforced. We met for lunch the next day, sitting across from each other in a small cafe we'd been going to since I was in college. She stirred her tea nervously, eyes fixed on the cup. She told me she was proud of me again, more firmly this time, but admitted she was struggling to understand where she fit now. For so long, her identity had been built around taking care of me, anticipating my needs before I voiced them. Without that role, she felt unmoored. I told her she didn't need to earn a place in my life by managing it, that I wanted her there because she was my mother, not because she could fix things for me. I told her I needed her support, not her supervision. She nodded slowly, tears threatening again, and said letting go felt like losing me all over again, like when my father left and she realized she was suddenly the only adult in the room. That confession reframed everything. I saw more clearly than ever how her control wasn't about mistrust in me, but mistrust in the world, a world that had already taken too much from her once. I reached across the table and held her hand, something I hadn't done in years. I told her I wasn't going anywhere, that owning a building didn't mean I'd outgrown her love or her place in my life. From that day on, we set clearer rules. She wouldn't speak for me or my property without asking first. I wouldn't shut her out of major decisions just to avoid uncomfortable conversations. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And honesty, I learned, was harder than secrecy, but far more durable. As months passed, the building continued to improve. Occupancy stabilized, repairs slowed, and I finally felt like I could breathe. I invited my mother over one Sunday afternoon, not as a helper or a fixer, but as a guest. I showed her the renovated units, the small garden I'd planted out back, the spreadsheet I used to track expenses. She listened, asked thoughtful questions, and didn't offer unsolicited advice. When we stood in the hallway together, she looked around with a kind of quiet awe and said she wished my father could see this. I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me felt anger, another part sadness, but mostly I felt gratitude that she'd shared the thought instead of burying it. I told her maybe he would have been proud, but that what mattered most was that she was. She smiled, a real smile, and said she was prouder than she knew how to say it. The for rent sign stayed in my drawer, a small paper reminder of how quickly love could turn into conflict if left unchecked. Sometimes I'd take it out and think about how easily things could have gone differently, how a simple lie of omission had nearly widened a gap I didn't know existed. It reminded me that ownership wasn't just about property, but about claiming responsibility for your choices and their impact on others. Our relationship didn't magically become perfect after that. We still argued occasionally, still misunderstood each other at times, but there was a new respect underneath it all, a recognition that we were both adults, shaped by the same past but moving towards different futures. She stopped seeing my independence as rejection. I stopped seeing her concern as interference. Somewhere in the middle, we found a balance that felt real. Looking back now, I understand that the shock of seeing that sign on my door was necessary. It forced a conversation we'd both been avoiding for years. It exposed fears we hadn't named and expectations we hadn't questioned. And it taught me that sometimes the hardest part of growing up isn't building a life of your own, but learning how to let the people who raised you see it without trying to control it.
After that incident, life settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly comfortable. My mother and I learned to navigate our new boundaries, though the process wasn't without bumps. There were mornings when she'd call me, voice laced with worry, asking if a tenant had complained about noise or if the heater was working. I would smile, patient but firm, reminding her that I had it under control. She'd sigh, a mixture of relief and lingering guilt, and say she just wanted to make sure I was okay. Sometimes I caught myself thinking, "I'm okay, Mom, let me manage it." But I understood her worry. It was part of who she was. One evening, about 2 months after the sign incident, she showed up unannounced at my door. My heart skipped a beat because unannounced visits had been a hallmark of her helpful years. But this time, she was different. She didn't come to fix or rearrange anything. She carried a small box, a gift she said she'd found while cleaning her closet. Inside were old photographs, some of me as a toddler, some of us together at holidays, some of the first apartments we'd lived in. She smiled softly and said, "I was thinking maybe it's time I remember all the places we've been instead of trying to control the ones you're in now." Her words caught me off guard. There was no guilt, no expectation, only reflection. I took the box, flipped through the photos, and realized how far we'd both come. I'd grown into someone capable of owning a building, handling finances, and making decisions without fear. She had grown into someone capable of letting go, trusting and celebrating that independence without needing control. I hugged her tightly, a long, quiet hug that said everything words couldn't. Around that same time, a challenge arrived that I hadn't anticipated. One of my tenants, a young single mother named Carla, came to me with tears in her eyes. Her rent had increased due to her own financial struggles, and she wasn't sure how she could stay. I listened, heart aching for her situation, and realized I had to make a choice between strict rules and compassion. I offered her a temporary reduction while she got back on her feet, and she left my office that evening hugging me like family. In that moment, I understood something critical. Owning property wasn't just about control or independence. It was about responsibility, empathy, and the power to impact people's lives. Later that week, I shared the story with my mother. I expected her to be critical, worried that I was too lenient, but she surprised me. She told me she was proud of how I handled it, proud that I could wield power with care. Her words were simple but powerful. "You're not just a landlord. You're becoming a good man, a man I can respect, not because I raised you, but because you've earned it." I remembered the day I first walked into the building I now owned. It had been dusty, unremarkable, and full of empty units, but I saw possibility. And now, years later, the building wasn't just mine. It was a symbol of resilience, independence, and growth. And so was my relationship with my mother.
but growth never comes without testing. One afternoon, a letter arrived from a real estate attorney. It claimed a distant cousin, someone I barely knew, had a claim to part of the building's property due to a decades-old will dispute. My heart sank. For a moment, the stability I'd fought so hard to build felt fragile. I called my mother immediately, partly for guidance, partly for comfort. She listened quietly, then said, "Whatever happens, you handle it with honesty. That's the only way this ends right." Her calmness steadied me, and I realized that in her own way, she had finally learned to trust me fully. I met with the attorney and reviewed documents for hours, nights stretching long as I navigated this legal maze. The tension was unbearable at times. I could feel my mother's worries seep through phone calls and texts. But each step reminded me that independence also meant facing challenges alone and asking for help when necessary, not just avoiding control or secrecy. Eventually, the dispute resolved in my favor. The will had been ambiguous, the cousin's claim weak, and the building remained fully mine. When I told my mother, I expected relief, maybe even celebration, but she surprised me again. She didn't focus on the legal victory. Instead, she said, "I watched you handle that without panicking, without trying to control everyone. That's all I wanted to see. You're ready for everything life throws at you." It hit me then how much my relationship with her had evolved. We no longer needed to guard our words or actions for fear of misinterpretation. We were learning a new way to coexist, one based on trust, respect, and shared history rather than hierarchy or control. Life continued, full of its ordinary chaos, tenants moving in and out, repairs that never seemed to end, financial spreadsheets that required constant attention. Yet amid it all, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing I had created something permanent. The building stood as a testament not just to my hard work, but to the lessons of patience, courage, and empathy I had learned along the way. And my mother, once a source of fear and guilt in moments of overreach, had become a partner in reflection and wisdom, guiding without controlling, loving without suffocating. One winter evening, we sat together on the balcony, drinking tea as snow lightly dusted the street below. She turned to me and said, softly, "You know, when I first saw that for rent sign on your door, I was shocked. I felt like I'd failed somehow, like I'd lost you to something I couldn't control. But now I see you needed that moment, and I needed to learn to let go." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The sign had been a spark, igniting a series of conversations, revelations, and growth that neither of us could have anticipated. It was a small piece of paper, yet it carried a weight that reshaped both of our lives. That night, I realized that independence and love weren't mutually exclusive. They could coexist, quietly, without drama, if nurtured with patience and honesty. And so, in that building I owned, surrounded by tenants whose lives I touched in small but meaningful ways, I learned that home isn't just the walls or the floors. It's the people you choose to let in, the trust you cultivate, and the love that evolves through understanding, mistakes, and forgiveness. My mother and I had discovered that truth together, and for the first time in years, our relationship felt whole, balanced between past and present, fear and trust, control and freedom. The following spring brought with it a sense of renewal, not just outside, where flowers pushed through the cracks of the sidewalks around my building, but inside me and my relationship with my mother. She started to visit more often, not to check up on me, but to be present. Sometimes she'd bring homemade bread or cookies. Sometimes she'd just sit quietly with a cup of tea, watching me sort through tenant applications or check on repairs. And I realized that her presence, when it came without expectation or assumption, was a comfort I hadn't fully appreciated until now. One afternoon, a situation arose that tested our new understanding. A tenant on the top floor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hanley, called in tears because her heating system had broken down. The pipes were old and the repair would take several days. She was cold, anxious, and scared of the bill she would incur. I arranged for a temporary solution, ensuring she had space heaters and someone checking in on her, but the situation was more stressful than I anticipated. My mother insisted on coming to help, offering to bring blankets, check on meals, and talk to Mrs. Hanley to ease her anxiety. I hesitated at first, but then remembered the progress we'd made. I let her come. Together, we went to the apartment, carrying supplies, chatting gently with Mrs. Hanley, listening to her fears without judgment, without rushing to fix them immediately. My mother didn't take over. She offered warmth and company, letting me handle the logistics. Afterward, we walked down the stairs together in silence. I realized then that she had finally learned the difference between helping and controlling, and that I had learned the patience to accept her help without resentment. It felt like a quiet victory, invisible to the outside world, but monumental in the landscape of our relationship. Life continued to move in its ordinary rhythms, but I started noticing small changes in the building itself. Tenants were more engaged, chatting in hallways, caring for the shared spaces. The garden I'd planted flourished with the care of residents who felt invested in the building's community. And as I observed these changes, I realized that ownership wasn't only about financial responsibility or personal independence. It was about creating a space where others could thrive. One day, my mother brought up something I hadn't expected. She said she'd been thinking about her own life, about all the apartments she'd rented, all the small sacrifices she'd made, and how she'd always wanted stability for us, even if she didn't have it herself. Her voice was quiet, reflective. She said, "I realize now that my fear of losing you sometimes made me overstep. I just wanted to make sure you were safe. But seeing you here, handling things on your own, I understand now." Her words struck me deeply. I saw the years of worry, the sacrifices, the quiet anxieties that had shaped so much of our dynamic, and I saw that she was finally acknowledging them, not to demand gratitude, but to share understanding. I told her that her guidance, even when overbearing at times, had given me the tools to stand where I was now, and she smiled, a mixture of relief and pride in her eyes. But peace, as always, comes with tests. A few weeks later, the building's roof developed a serious leak during a heavy rainstorm. Water seeped into multiple units, causing damage and panic. I spent days coordinating repairs, dealing with insurance claims, and ensuring tenants were safe. The stress was immense, but my mother refused to be sidelined. She showed up with supplies, helping cover furniture, moving small items, and even organizing hot meals for tenants who were temporarily displaced. Watching her work, I realized how much she had changed. She was no longer trying to control my life, but she was fully capable of offering support, stepping in where it was helpful, and stepping back where it wasn't. And I, in turn, had the patience and confidence to allow her in without feeling undermined. It was a delicate dance of boundaries and love, one that required constant adjustment, but felt far more rewarding than our previous misunderstandings. During one quiet moment on the roof, as the rain finally eased, I sat with her, letting the sound of dripping water fill the silence. She turned to me and said, "You know, I've been thinking a lot about that for rent sign. At the time, it felt like the worst thing in the world, but now I see it was a catalyst. It forced us to confront truths we'd been avoiding for years." I nodded, realizing she was right. That small, seemingly insignificant action had opened the door to honesty, vulnerability, and a deeper understanding between us. The building, my mother, and I were intertwined now in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every tenant interaction, every repair, every challenge became a lesson in patience, empathy, and communication. I learned to balance authority with compassion, independence with connection. My mother learned to trust without controlling, to support without overstepping. And together, we rebuilt not just an apartment building, but the fragile, beautiful architecture of our relationship. One evening, I found myself walking through the empty hallways, the smell of fresh paint and new carpeting lingering in the air. I stopped at each door, imagining the lives within, realizing that my choices affected more than just myself. Ownership wasn't just a title, it was a responsibility to people, to community, and to myself. And somewhere deep down, I felt my mother's influence in every thoughtful decision I made, the lessons she taught, the sacrifices she endured, and the love she offered in her own imperfect human way. That evening, as I lay in my apartment, I reflected on the journey. The for rent sign had been a spark of chaos, a test of boundaries, and ultimately a doorway to deeper understanding. It reminded me that independence isn't about isolation. It's about learning to navigate the world with confidence, integrity, and compassion. And love, even when complicated by fear or control, can grow stronger when met with honesty and patience. The next morning, I called my mother just to say hello. She answered immediately, warmth in her voice, and asked how I was. We spoke about small, ordinary things, repairs, tenants, plans for the garden, without drama, without tension, and for the first time in a long time, our conversation felt truly equal, grounded in mutual respect and understanding. I realized that life, like ownership, is about balance between control and freedom, independence and connection, fear and trust. Years later, when I look back at that moment, the day she listed my apartment for rent without asking, I no longer see it as betrayal or conflict. I see it as a turning point, a moment that forced us both to confront our fears, assumptions, and expectations. It was a reminder that family, like property, requires careful attention, boundaries, and care. That love is strongest not when it controls, but when it trusts, and that sometimes a small spark of chaos is exactly what's needed to illuminate the truths we've been avoiding.
Months turned into a year, and life in the building began to feel like its own rhythm, a pulse I could almost predict. I had learned to handle the day-to-day stress, the late-night calls from tenants, the unexpected repairs, and even the occasional confrontation with neighbors. Each challenge reminded me that owning a building wasn't just about the financial side, it was about patience, empathy, and learning to navigate people's lives with care. My mother had become an unlikely partner in this. She still showed up, but now it was intentional. She wasn't there to manage me. She was there to participate, to share her wisdom when needed, and to enjoy the small victories alongside me. One afternoon, I received a call from Mrs. Hanley, the elderly tenant on the top floor, asking me to come upstairs. Her voice was unsteady, so I hurried over, expecting an emergency. When I opened her door, I found her sitting in a chair, tears glistening in her eyes. She held an old photo album in her lap. She told me she'd been living in apartments her whole life, moving from one temporary place to another, never feeling a sense of permanence. But here, in this building, with the sense of care and stability I'd cultivated, she finally felt at home. She said it was like she could breathe for the first time in years. I felt a lump in my throat. Her words weren't just about her experience. They were about the impact of my mother's lessons, the sacrifices she had made for me, and the values she had instilled, even without realizing it. I realized that my ownership wasn't just financial, it was moral and emotional. Every decision I made affected lives,
just as my mother's guidance, intentional or not, had shaped mine. That moment was a quiet revelation. Independence and responsibility weren't separate, they were intertwined. That evening, I called my mother. I wanted to share the moment, to let her see the tangible result of what she had helped create, even from the sidelines. She answered almost immediately, her voice warm and curious, asking what had happened. I told her about Mrs. Hanley and how she felt at home, how she felt cared for. My mother was silent for a moment, then whispered, "I see it. I see the good you're doing. You've made a place that's more than walls and floors. It's love." I couldn't help but smile, the words filling a space I hadn't realized had been aching for acknowledgement. Over the next several months, more challenges came, as they always do in life. One of the lower floor tenants had an emergency that required urgent repairs. Another faced financial hardship and asked for a temporary reduction in rent. And yet again, my mother was there, not to take control, not to make decisions for me, but to offer support. She cooked meals, helped with temporary relocation logistics, and even stayed overnight to help comfort tenants who were anxious. Watching her operate in this new way, helpful but not controlling, was profoundly moving. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were arguments, tense conversations, and moments of frustration. She would still occasionally overstep, assuming she knew best, and I would have to gently remind her of boundaries. But the difference was stark. Before, these moments had felt like betrayal or disrespect. Now, they were part of a dynamic where love, respect, and patience coexisted. Our relationship had matured in a way that mirrored the growth I had achieved as a building owner, careful, deliberate, and resilient. One evening, after a particularly long day of handling tenant issues and repairs, I found myself sitting on the balcony with my mother. The city lights glittered below, the hum of life around us, and I realized how far we had come. I asked her if she remembered the day she put that "for rent" sign on my door, the day that had started this whole journey. She smiled softly, her eyes reflecting a mixture of guilt and nostalgia. She said, "I do," she quietly said. "I thought I was helping. I never realized how much it would hurt or how much I'd be teaching you instead of controlling you. That moment, it changed everything, didn't it?" I nodded. It did. It forced honesty, boundaries, and understanding, and it taught both of us something about trust and love. We sat in silence, both of us reflecting on the years, the challenges, and the lessons we had learned. It struck me that relationships, like buildings, required maintenance. They couldn't be neglected or cracks would appear, but when tended to with care, they could withstand storms, time, and mistakes, growing stronger rather than weaker. As time went on, I started documenting the lessons I had learned, not just about building management, but about relationships, independence, and family. I realized that the story of my mother and me wasn't unique, it was universal. So many people experience the tension between love and control, between independence and responsibility, and I hoped that by sharing our story, I could help someone else navigate that delicate balance. The building itself became a reflection of my growth. Each apartment, each tenant, each small repair mirrored the way I was learning to interact with the world, thoughtfully, patiently, and with intention. I noticed the small details, the way tenants greeted each other, how they treated shared spaces, how they approached me with concerns, not as burdens, but as trust. That trust was more valuable than any financial gain. One day, a young couple moved into one of the vacant units. The wife reminded me of myself when I had first moved in, ambitious, cautious, and quietly anxious about handling a new responsibility. I offered them guidance without taking over, support without control. Watching them settle in, I felt a profound sense of continuity, knowing that the lessons I had learned from my mother and the challenges we had faced together were now rippling outward, shaping new lives. As the sun set over the city that evening, I reflected on the journey. From a simple for rent sign that sparked shock and tension to the growth, trust, and understanding that followed, I realized that life rarely gives you lessons in convenient packages. Often, they arrive disguised as mistakes, misunderstandings, or small acts of chaos, and it's up to us to recognize them, learn from them, and allow them to transform us. For my mother and me, that transformation was profound. We had moved from a dynamic of fear, control, and secrecy to one of trust, respect, and shared pride. I owned the building, yes, but more importantly, I had built a bridge to her heart, one that allowed love and independence to coexist without friction. And in that bridge, in the quiet moments of reflection and support, I discovered a truth I will carry for the rest of my life. Ownership, whether of property or relationships, is not about possession. It is about responsibility, empathy, and the courage to let go when holding on would do more harm than good.
The following months brought a sense of rhythm to the building, a flow I could finally recognize and predict. But life, of course, doesn't wait for comfort. One chilly autumn morning, I received a call from a tenant on the first floor, a young man named James. He was panicked, voice cracking, because the ceiling in his apartment had started leaking again after a heavy rainfall overnight. I grabbed my coat and rushed over, and when I opened the door, water was dripping from the corner of his living room. Furniture was soaked, and he looked utterly defeated. I immediately got to work. I called the repair service, set up temporary accommodations for James, and began cleaning up the damage. But in that moment, I also realized how exhausting and relentless building ownership could be. This wasn't just about money or structure. It was about lives, about people trusting me to solve problems even when I felt overwhelmed. My mother called me later that afternoon, sensing my tension through the phone, and asked if she could come by. I hesitated, but then remembered how she had learned to support without controlling. When she arrived, she carried towels, buckets, and a determination I had seen so many times in my childhood. But this time, it was different. She wasn't bossing me, telling me what to do. She was helping, standing beside me, sharing the weight. Together we cleaned, assessed damages, and even comforted James, who was grateful not just for the repairs, but for our presence. Watching my mother operate this way, I realized she had finally understood the balance I had struggled to maintain for so long. She could care, guide, and act without overstepping boundaries, and it was a revelation. That evening, after James had settled in with temporary arrangements, my mother and I sat on the balcony overlooking the city skyline as the sun dipped low. She was quiet, sipping her tea, watching the building in a way that seemed to measure not its value in dollars, but in lives and stories. I broke the silence, asking her how she felt now about the day she had listed my apartment for rent without asking me. She looked down at her cup, thought for a moment, and said softly, "I see now that I was clinging to fear, not reality. I was afraid of losing you in ways that had nothing to do with you. I thought control could protect us, but it only made things complicated." Her eyes met mine, sincere and reflective. "I should have trusted you sooner, but I'm glad I didn't realize my mistake too late." Her words struck me. I realized that the lessons we learn as children about trust and boundaries often come full circle. Just as I had to learn independence and responsibility, she had to learn restraint and faith. It was a dynamic I never fully anticipated, but one that reshaped both of us. In the weeks that followed, the building seemed almost alive, a reflection of the growth happening within it and within me. Tenants were calmer, more engaged, and began treating the space not as temporary shelter, but as a community they cared about. I instituted small changes, adding bulletin boards for announcements, planting more flowers in shared spaces, creating a small library with donated books. It wasn't glamorous, but it was purposeful, and I realized purpose gave ownership a deeper meaning. One day, a neighbor knocked on my door unexpectedly. She was a woman named Linda, elderly and sharp-eyed, with a penchant for gossip and advice. She asked about my mother, mentioning how she had noticed the changes in her behavior over the past year. I explained lightly how our relationship had evolved, emphasizing boundaries, trust, and mutual respect. Linda listened thoughtfully, then nodded. "It's rare," she said, "for parents and children to reach the stage. You're both lucky." Her words lingered with me. I understood then that our journey was not just private, it was a quiet testament to change and resilience. Another challenge came when a small plumbing issue turned into a major repair across multiple units. The tenants were frustrated, tempers flaring, and I found myself balancing not just practical fixes, but emotional reassurance. My mother appeared once again, not to instruct, but to help smooth tensions. She helped tenants with meals, explained timelines, and offered comfort where I couldn't. I watched her, heart swelling, realizing that she had finally learned to navigate the line between care and interference. It was like watching the old and the new versions of her coexist in harmony. One evening, after a particularly long day of repairs and tenant concerns, we both sat quietly in my apartment. The building was silent, except for the faint hum of distant traffic. My mother turned to me and said, "I never realized how heavy this could be, the responsibility, the constant decisions. I thought managing your life was enough, but now I see it's about guiding without overstepping, supporting without controlling." I nodded. Exactly. And that's why the sign incident mattered. It forced honesty, confrontation, and boundaries that ultimately strengthened both of us. She smiled, a mixture of pride and relief in her eyes. "I see that now. I see you, not the child I need to protect, but the adult I can respect." And in that moment, I understood fully that our relationship had transformed from one defined by fear, assumptions, and control into one built on trust, patience, and love. Time passed, and the building continued to flourish. I implemented small improvements, ensured tenants felt heard, and cultivated a sense of community that had been missing for decades. My mother became a familiar presence, helping where needed, giving advice where asked, but always respecting the boundaries we had established. Our bond grew stronger, not through words alone, but through shared experience, empathy, and understanding. I often think back to the day I saw that "for rent" sign on my door. The shock, the hurt, the confusion, it all felt overwhelming in the moment. But looking back, I can see now that it was the catalyst for everything that followed. Without that confrontation, without the challenge to my autonomy, we might never have reached this level of mutual understanding. It was a painful gift, disguised as an error, teaching lessons that shaped not just my life, but the building, the tenants, and my mother as well. Eventually, I found myself mentoring a young couple, new tenants, who reminded me of my own cautious, ambitious self when I first purchased the building. I shared insights with them about community, responsibility, and boundaries, without overstepping, without imposing control. I realized then that ownership isn't just about property, it's about influence, example, and the ripple effect of the decisions you make. The lessons my mother had taught me, even unintentionally, were now passing on to others. By the time winter arrived, the building felt alive in a way I hadn't anticipated. Lights flickered warmly from apartment windows, tenants spoke to each other in shared hallways, and there was a quiet hum of belonging that filled the air. My mother and I would sit together, sometimes sharing tea, sometimes simply watching the world go by. We rarely discussed the past unless one of us initiated it, but the memory of that "for rent" sign lingered as a reminder that chaos and misunderstanding, when met with honesty and patience, could transform relationships into something stronger, deeper, and more resilient than either of us had imagined. By the spring, the building had become more than just a source of income or a project. It was a home, a community, a place where lives intersected in quiet but meaningful ways. I had tenants I genuinely cared about, tenants who had begun to trust me not only as a landlord, but as someone who genuinely had their best interest at heart. And my mother, who once would have seen the building as her domain to manage or organize, now moved through it with a light touch, offering help only when asked, listening without judgment, and celebrating successes quietly alongside me. One afternoon, I received a phone call from a tenant whose unit was on the second floor.
Her young son had been playing near the stairwell and had scraped his knee badly. She was panicked, worried about infection and bruising, and I felt the familiar rush of responsibility. I grabbed a first aid kit, rushed up, and tended to the wound as best I could. The mother looked at me with a mixture of relief and gratitude. I felt a deep, almost surprising pride. This was more than property management. This was guardianship, stewardship, responsibility. After she left, my mother appeared in the doorway. She'd followed me up quietly, carrying an extra blanket and some bandages. She didn't lecture, didn't scold, didn't take over. She simply helped, guided, offered her support in a way that was both respectful and loving. I realized then that our dynamic had shifted completely. I no longer felt defensive about her presence. I welcomed it because it came without expectation, without intrusion. It was partnership, not control, and it felt profound. Around that same time, I had a realization about the broader meaning of ownership. The building wasn't just mine in a financial sense. It belonged, in some intangible way, to everyone who lived in it, to everyone whose lives it touched. The choices I made affected more than my own comfort or security. They affected children, elderly tenants, young couples, single parents, and even my mother. Ownership, I realized, was about responsibility, empathy, and integrity. It was a lesson I had learned painfully and one that I now carried with care. One morning, as I walked through the hallways inspecting the units, I overheard tenants chatting in the lobby. They were discussing the small library I had installed, complimenting each other on books borrowed and returned, sharing notes and suggestions. It was a moment that filled me with quiet satisfaction. The building had become more than four walls and a roof. It had become a place of community, belonging, and mutual respect, a tangible representation of the lessons I had learned from my mother and through my own mistakes. That evening, my mother and I sat on the balcony, drinking tea and watching the sunset over the city. I asked her how she felt about the journey we had shared, from the shock and hurt of the for rent sign to the present, where she had become a supportive, respectful presence in the building without overstepping. She paused for a moment, reflecting before saying, "It's been a long road, hasn't it? I used to think independence meant pushing you away, teaching you how to survive without me. Now I see it's about trust, respect, and understanding." Her words resonated deeply. I realized that our relationship had matured in ways I hadn't anticipated. It was no longer defined by old patterns of control, fear, or secrecy. Instead, it was defined by mutual respect, shared experiences, and the ability to support each other without overstepping. We had both grown, and the building, in a way, had been the catalyst. Later that same week, a small crisis struck when a pipe burst in one of the lower units, flooding part of the hallway and damaging several apartments. The tenants were understandably upset, and I immediately mobilized repairs. My mother arrived soon after, carrying cleaning supplies and blankets for the affected residents. She moved through the chaos with calm efficiency, offering support without dictating the actions I had already taken. Watching her, I marveled at how far we had come. She had learned to trust me, and I had learned to let her help without resentment. That evening, after the repairs were completed, we sat together in my apartment, exhausted but quietly proud of what we had accomplished. She turned to me and said, "I never realized how much strength it takes to do what you do every day. I used to think I was protecting you from the world, but now I see you're capable of facing it on your own, and sometimes even teaching me along the way." Her words were humbling. I realized that independence wasn't about isolation. It was about growth, responsibility, and the courage to navigate challenges while remaining connected to those who loved you. My mother had taught me this lesson indirectly through her overprotectiveness, her fear, and even her mistakes. And now, through her quiet presence and support, she continued to teach me, but in a way that respected my boundaries and my autonomy. Over the next several months, the building continued to flourish. The tenants grew more engaged, more connected, and more invested in the community we had created. My mother became a cherished figure among them, known for her warmth, her willingness to help, and her quiet wisdom. She had transformed from a figure of overreach to one of guidance, and I saw the profound impact this had on everyone around us. One evening, as we walked through the lobby together, a young couple approached my mother. They thanked her for helping them navigate a minor repair issue and for her thoughtful advice on decorating their apartment. They looked at me with gratitude too, and I realized that the lessons my mother and I had learned together were rippling outward, affecting not just our relationship, but the lives of everyone in the building. Later that night, as my mother and I sat together on the balcony, sipping tea, I reflected on the journey we had shared, from the shock and hurt of the for rent sign to the growth, trust, and mutual respect that now defined our relationship. I realized how transformative that moment had been. It had forced us to confront our fears, communicate honestly, and establish boundaries that ultimately strengthened both of us. Looking back, I understood that the building was more than just property. It was a reflection of the lessons I had learned, the growth I had achieved, and the love I had cultivated with my mother. Ownership, I realized, wasn't about possession. It was about responsibility, empathy, and the courage to let go when holding on would do more harm than good. And in that understanding, I found a profound sense of peace. My mother and I had transformed our relationship, the building had become a home, and the tenants had become a community. All of it was the result of a single, unexpected moment, the day a for rent sign appeared on my door, and the way we chose to respond to it.
As the seasons changed, the building began to feel alive in ways I hadn't anticipated. Spring brought fresh flowers in the small garden out front. Summer filled the hallways with the laughter of children playing in the courtyard, and autumn painted the streets in gold and amber. I would walk through the building, listening to tenants' conversations, hearing their stories, seeing the little things they did to care for each other, and I realized that this place had become more than just a building. It was a community. My mother and I had also settled into a rhythm. She had learned to offer help without taking over, to provide guidance without judgment. I, in turn, had learned to accept support without resentment or defensiveness. It was a delicate balance, one that required patience, understanding, and constant awareness, but it was worth every challenge. I could see the difference in her demeanor, too. The constant worry that had once driven her actions had softened. She still cared deeply, but she had learned to trust, to step back, and to allow me to navigate life on my own terms. One afternoon, a young tenant named Rosa knocked on my door. She was holding a stack of papers, looking flustered. She explained that she had applied for a scholarship and needed a letter of recommendation, but the deadline was the next day. She had forgotten to ask me sooner. I smiled, telling her not to worry. I wrote the letter carefully, speaking to her character, work ethic, and responsibility, and watched her eyes light up with gratitude. Afterward, my mother came in quietly. She had observed the interaction and whispered, "You're really shaping these young lives, aren't you? They see you as more than a landlord." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words. Ownership wasn't just about property. It was about influence, mentorship, and responsibility. The lessons I had learned from her, from the challenges we had faced together, were now rippling outward, shaping others in ways I hadn't anticipated. Around that time, I received a letter from a local community group inviting me to speak about building management and community engagement. I hesitated at first, unsure if I was ready to share our story publicly, but my mother encouraged me gently. "You've learned a lot. Sharing it might help others navigate similar challenges," she said. Her voice carried the weight of experience, wisdom, and love. It struck me how far we had come, from conflict and misunderstanding to mutual respect and support. I agreed to speak, and when the day came, I stood in front of a small audience of local landlords, tenants, and community leaders. I told the story of the building, of ownership, responsibility, and the lessons learned through challenges and mistakes. I emphasized the importance of trust, communication, and empathy, not just in property management, but in all relationships. Afterwards, several people approached me, thanking me for the insights. One woman shared that she had a similar experience with her adult child, and that hearing my story gave her hope for rebuilding trust. A man said he now understood the importance of boundaries and empathy in his own landlord-tenant relationships. I realized then that the struggles my mother and I had faced weren't unique, they were universal, and by navigating them thoughtfully, we had created a ripple effect, impacting lives far beyond our building. Back at home, my mother and I sat together on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker below. She reached over, taking my hand in hers, and said quietly, "I never realized how much strength and patience it takes to manage all of this, to guide without controlling. I'm proud of you, not just for the building, but for who you've become." Her words filled a space in me I hadn't realized was still waiting for acknowledgement. I squeezed her hand, understanding fully that our relationship had transformed, that we had both grown through challenge, honesty, and patience. That evening, I walked through the hallways, checking on tenants, observing the life happening within each unit. I stopped at the door of a young couple who had recently moved in. They were decorating their space, laughing, and working together. I realized then that my mother's lessons, combined with my own experiences, had created a foundation for this building to become more than walls and floors. It was now a home, a place where people felt safe, valued, and seen. Months passed and the building continued to thrive. The tenants had formed a community that extended beyond the property, helping each other in times of need, celebrating milestones together, and sharing in everyday joys. My mother became a cherished figure among them, offering wisdom, support, and kindness without overstepping boundaries. Watching her interact with them, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey we had shared, the mistakes, the conflicts, the revelations, and the growth. One particularly quiet evening, as we sat on the balcony with tea, my mother turned to me and said, "Do you remember that day with the for rent sign? How angry and shocked I was?" I nodded. She smiled softly. "I see now that it wasn't just about the sign. It was about us learning to trust each other, to set boundaries, and to grow together. I'm grateful for that day, as difficult as it was. It taught me how to let go, and it taught you how to stand firm." Her words echoed in my mind as I looked out over the city. The building, the tenants, and my relationship with my mother were all intertwined, each influencing the other in subtle and profound ways. I realized that life, much like ownership, is not about possession or control. It is about responsibility, empathy, and the courage to face challenges while nurturing those we love. That night, I reflected on the journey, from the shock of the for rent sign to the growth, trust, and understanding that now defined our lives. The building had become a living testament to the lessons I had learned: independence tempered with compassion, ownership balanced with empathy, and love strengthened through honesty and patience. And in that reflection, I understood a truth I would carry with me forever: that family, like property, requires care, attention, and respect. Boundaries are essential, trust is vital, and love is most powerful when it allows freedom without fear. The for rent sign, once a symbol of misunderstanding and conflict, had become a marker of transformation, a reminder that even in the most challenging moments, growth and connection are possible. Winter settled in with its quiet, reflective calm, blanketing the city in frost and soft snow.
The building, now humming with life and community, felt like a living organism, each tenant a vital part of its heartbeat. Walking through the hallways, I noticed small gestures, a neighbor helping another carry groceries, a child leaving a note thanking the maintenance team for fixing the heater, someone watering the small garden in the courtyard. These simple acts reminded me that ownership wasn't about control, it was about creating space where care could flourish. My mother had become a steady presence. She stopped calling multiple times a day with worries about tenants or finances, but she remained involved in subtle ways. Sometimes she would check in on elderly tenants, make sure someone had hot meals, or simply sit and listen to stories they wanted to share. She had learned that support didn't mean management, and I had learned to welcome it without feeling undermined. Her transformation was almost as remarkable as mine. One evening, a situation arose that tested everything we had learned. A young tenant, struggling financially, came to me in tears, explaining that she might have to move out because she couldn't pay rent for the upcoming month. My heart sank. I knew that if I denied her request, she would be displaced, but if I allowed a temporary adjustment, I risked financial strain elsewhere. I paused, thinking through options, and then I remembered the lessons my mother had inadvertently taught me: empathy, patience, and responsible problem-solving. I offered her a short-term rent reduction and helped connect her with local resources. My mother, who had arrived to help without expecting control, stayed with me through the process, assisting in contacting charities and community programs. Together, we helped stabilize her situation. Watching her relief and gratitude made me realize that ownership was more than property, it was a platform for impact. We had created not just a building, but a space where people could feel supported, safe, and respected. Later that night, my mother and I sat quietly in the living room of my apartment. The building was calm, lights flickering softly in the windows as tenants settled in for the night. She turned to me and said, "You know, I used to think managing your life meant keeping you safe, but I see now it's more important to let you face challenges, make decisions, and grow. And yet, you let me be part of it without taking over." I smiled, understanding the weight of her words. "It took time," I said gently, "but you had to learn just as I had to learn. That sign, the shock of it, it started everything. It forced us both to confront our fears and understand each other in a way we never had before." She nodded, eyes misty. "I'm proud of you, not just for the building, but for how you've handled everything. You've become someone I can respect fully, not just because I raised you, but because of the person you've chosen to be." Her words filled me with a deep sense of closure and affirmation. The coming months continued with their challenges, yet the rhythm of the building and our lives felt grounded. Repairs, tenant disputes, and financial pressures still arose, but we faced them with patience and clarity, supporting each other when necessary, stepping back when appropriate. I noticed the subtle but profound effect on my mother. She seemed lighter, more confident in her place, not in control, not detached, but present in a healthy, balanced way. One particularly striking moment occurred during a community event I organized for the tenants. It was a small gathering in the courtyard with lights strung overhead, snacks, and music. Families chatted, children played, and neighbors shared stories. My mother, who had always been shy in social settings, mingled effortlessly, offering guidance and warmth, but never domination. I watched her interact with tenants and realized how far we had come, from confrontation and misunderstanding to collaboration and mutual respect. During the event, a tenant approached me, thanking me for the way I handled the building, the way I created a sense of community, and for allowing my mother to participate without overstepping. He said it reminded him of how families should function: support without control, love without manipulation.
His words resonated deeply, a confirmation that the lessons we had learned weren't just personal, they were universal. Later that evening, as the gathering wound down and the courtyard emptied, my mother and I stood together quietly. The warm lights cast soft shadows, and the laughter from earlier still lingered in the air. She turned to me and said, "I never thought I'd see the day when I could be part of something like this without feeling the need to control it. Watching you, seeing what you've built, it's more than a building, it's life." I nodded, feeling the full weight of her statement. The building had become a living testament to growth, responsibility, and the delicate balance between independence and support. And in that balance, we had both found a deeper understanding of ourselves and each other. The months rolled on, each one reinforcing the lessons we had learned. I realized that the true challenge of ownership wasn't in managing finances or property, it was in managing relationships, maintaining integrity, and fostering trust. My mother had shown me that support could coexist with independence, just as I had shown her letting go didn't mean abandoning love. Together, we had navigated a journey that transformed not just a building, but our hearts and minds. By the following winter, the building had truly become a home. Tenants looked out for one another, there was laughter in the hallways, and a sense of belonging permeated every corner. My mother had become a cherished figure in the community, offering wisdom and warmth without overstepping, and I had become a confident, compassionate owner who understood that property and people were inseparable. One evening, as snow fell gently outside, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had begun with a simple "for rent" sign. The shock, the anger, the hurt, it all seemed distant now, almost surreal. That moment had forced honesty, confrontation, and growth. It had reshaped my relationship with my mother, deepened my understanding of responsibility, and taught me the profound value of empathy and patience. I realized, finally, that life often teaches its most important lessons through discomfort and surprise. That small, seemingly insignificant event had ignited a transformation, revealing truths about trust, love, and independence that would remain with me forever. And in that realization, I found peace, not just in my relationship with my mother, but in the life I had built, the community I had nurtured, and the home I had created. By the time the next spring arrived, everything had settled into a rhythm that felt steady, meaningful, and profoundly alive. The building hummed with life, not just as a physical space, but as a place where stories intersected, where people felt seen, valued, and supported. Walking through the hallways, I noticed tenants chatting, children laughing, neighbors exchanging small acts of kindness. Each interaction reminded me that ownership wasn't about possession, it was about fostering care, responsibility, and connection. My mother and I had reached a stage in our relationship that felt rare. We no longer navigated our interactions with fear, defensiveness, or unspoken resentment. She had learned to trust my judgment, to offer guidance without taking control, and to participate without overstepping boundaries. I had learned to accept her support without defensiveness, to let her be present without interpreting her concern as interference. Our bond had shifted from a parent-child dynamic defined by fear and control to a partnership built on respect, love, and shared history. One day I was walking through the lobby when a young couple approached me. Their daughter had been struggling with schoolwork, and they asked if I could help mediate a tutoring arrangement. I agreed, and my mother, who had been nearby, offered to assist with organization and logistics. What struck me was how natural it felt. She wasn't overstepping, but contributing, supporting without commandeering. The couple expressed gratitude not just for the practical help, but for the environment of trust and care we had cultivated. It was a quiet affirmation of everything we had worked toward. That evening, my mother and I sat on the balcony with tea, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She turned to me and said softly, "Do you remember the for rent sign? How chaotic and hurtful it felt at the time?" I nodded. Yes, I remember. It shocked me. I felt like my world was being rewritten without my consent. She smiled faintly. It was a moment of disruption, yes, but also a moment of revelation. It forced us to confront truths we had been avoiding, about each other, about ourselves, and about the way we navigate love and independence. Her words lingered in the cool evening air. I realized that the sign had been a catalyst, a spark that ignited a series of conversations, confrontations, and ultimately growth. Without that shock, we might have continued living in parallel, careful not to upset the other, never fully acknowledging the boundaries or needs that had silently shaped our relationship. That small act of chaos had forced us to communicate, to respect, and to understand in ways that would have taken years otherwise. Over the next months, life continued with its challenges, but the building and our relationship were resilient. Pipes broke, tenants had disputes, financial pressures emerged, but each time my mother and I navigated these challenges together. She offered help where it was needed, stepped back when it wasn't, and never tried to take control. I made decisions with confidence, respecting her wisdom and presence without fear of judgment. Our interactions had become a delicate balance of trust, empathy, and mutual respect, the kind of relationship many hope for but few achieve. One particular incident stood out. A long-term tenant, Mr. Patel, faced eviction due to financial hardship. The stress and fear in his voice were palpable when he called me. I assessed the situation, coordinated a payment plan, and offered temporary assistance. My mother arrived shortly after, bringing meals and comforting the family. She did not speak for me, did not interfere, but simply supported. Witnessing her presence and the relief it brought the tenant made me realize that our growth as individuals had created ripples far beyond ourselves. The lessons we learned together, patience, empathy, and the courage to trust, were now impacting lives in tangible, meaningful ways. I often reflected on the journey, especially on quiet nights when the building was still and the city outside seemed to pause. The for rent sign, which had once represented betrayal, fear, and miscommunication, had become a symbol of transformation. It had forced honesty, confrontation, and clarity. It had reshaped my relationship with my mother and, indirectly, the lives of the tenants who relied on us. What had begun as chaos had evolved into trust, care, and mutual respect. By the end of that year, the building felt truly like home. Tenants had developed a sense of belonging, a community that extended beyond the individual units. My mother had become a respected, cherished presence, guiding without controlling, offering wisdom without judgment. I had grown into someone who could balance authority with compassion, independence with connection, and responsibility with empathy. The building, the people within it, and my mother and I had all become reflections of one another, a living testament to growth, trust, and understanding. One winter evening, as snow blanketed the streets, my mother and I sat together quietly, sipping tea. She looked at me, her eyes reflecting the soft light, and said softly, "Do you know how much I needed to let go, to trust, to step back? Watching you, seeing what you've built, it's more than just a building, it's life." I nodded, feeling the full weight of that realization. Ownership wasn't about control or power. It wasn't about possession or dominance. It was about responsibility, empathy, and the courage to let go when holding on would do more harm than good. Love, too, followed the same principles. It required patience, respect, trust, and the willingness to face challenges together without fear.
Looking back, I understood that our journey, the shock, the confrontation, the struggles, had been necessary. It had revealed truths about fear, love, boundaries, and growth that neither of us could have learned any other way. It had transformed our relationship from one defined by control and anxiety to one defined by mutual respect, trust, and love. And it had taught me that life's most meaningful lessons often arrive disguised as mistakes, miscommunication, or unexpected disruptions. The building stood as a quiet monument to these lessons. Every tenant interaction, every small act of kindness, every challenge met with patience and care reflected the growth and understanding my mother and I had cultivated. Our story, the journey from shock to clarity, from fear to trust, from conflict to collaboration, was now woven into the very fabric of this place. As I watched the snow fall that evening, I felt a profound sense of closure. The for rent sign that had once symbolized misunderstanding and betrayal had become a marker of transformation. It had forced honesty, confrontation, and clarity. It had reshaped my relationship with my mother and, indirectly, the lives of the tenants who relied on us. What had begun as chaos had evolved into trust, care, and mutual respect. By the end of that year, the building felt truly like home. Tenants had developed a sense of belonging, a community that extended beyond the individual units. My mother had become a respected, cherished presence, guiding without controlling, offering wisdom without judgment. I had grown into someone who could balance authority with compassion, independence with connection, and responsibility with empathy. The building, the people within it, and my mother and I had all become reflections of one another, a living testament to growth, trust, and understanding. One winter evening, as snow blanketed the streets, my mother and I sat together quietly, sipping tea. She looked at me, her eyes reflecting the soft light, and said softly, "Do you know how much I needed to let go, to trust, to step back? Watching you, seeing what you've built, it's more than just a building, it's life." I nodded, feeling the full weight of that realization. Ownership wasn't about control or power. It wasn't about possession or dominance. It was about responsibility, empathy, and the courage to let go when holding on would do more harm than good. Love, too, followed the same principles. It required patience, respect, trust, and the willingness to face challenges together without fear. Looking back, I understood that our journey, the shock, the confrontation, the struggles, had been necessary. It had revealed truths about fear, love, boundaries, and growth that neither of us could have learned any other way. It had transformed our relationship from one defined by control and anxiety to one defined by mutual respect, trust, and love. And it had taught me that life's most meaningful lessons often arrive disguised as mistakes, miscommunication, or unexpected disruptions. The building stood as a quiet monument to these lessons.